In the oldest rooms of the human story, there is a silence where an explanation should be. People learned to shape stone, read weather, follow herds, and keep children alive through winters that did not forgive mistakes. And yet, somewhere along that long road, humans began doing something that looks less like survival and more like conversation with the unseen. Graves become careful. Walls become painted. Certain places begin to feel chosen, as if the land itself had been addressed. Why did a species already fluent in tools suddenly begin creating religion? So before the body sinks completely into this comfort, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what is being built here. And if you feel like it, share your location and your local time in the comments so this quiet night can feel a little more connected across the world. Religion does not leave a clear birth certificate. It arrives as a change in attention, and attention is the one thing archaeology cannot exhume intact. What remains are gestures hardened into matter, ochre on bone, shells carried far inland, a body positioned with strange care, an object left beside a skull as if it still mattered. Each discovery asks an uncomfortable question. Was this belief, or simply habit? Was it grief, or practicality? Was it a story, or only a moment that later observers want to turn into a story? Even the famous early burials resist certainty. Some Middle Paleolithic graves linked to Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens have been read as ritual care for the dead. Others argue that roots, water, animals, and sediments can imitate intention. The debate is not a technical footnote, it is the heart of the mystery. When evidence is thin, the mind leans toward meaning, and meaning easily resembles faith. Still, a pattern persists across time and place. Humans often treat death as more than disposal. A corpse is not only removed, it is placed. Something is done slowly, as if someone might be watching, even if the watcher is only memory. And memory is already an invisible presence. To remember a person is to keep them partly alive inside the living, and that internal afterlife may be one of the earliest doorways to religious feeling. Then the story moves into darkness, into caves, where images appear far from daylight. At sites like Chauvet and Lascaux, art is hidden deep in chambers where sound changes and the air feels ancient. The paintings are layered and revisited, as if returning mattered. Some scholars see ritual, initiation, or altered states. Others warn that ritual can be a modern substitute for ignorance. Yet one detail remains. People went inward, into the earth, to make images not meant for ordinary eyes. A private gallery makes little sense unless the audience is not only human. A quieter suspicion forms here. Humans may have created religion because the human mind is prepared to feel surrounded. Cognitive researchers have proposed that people tend to detect agency too easily, because in a dangerous world it is safer to mistake wind for a predator than to miss the predator entirely. A rustle becomes a warning. A coincidence becomes a message. Once the mind is tuned this way, forces begin to look like persons. Storms feel angry. Luck feels intimate. The world looks inhabited. And because humans are unusually skilled at imagining what others think and want, that sense of inhabitation can become elaborate. The mental tool used for navigating friendships can, under uncertainty, populate the night with listeners. Not because anyone planned to invent gods, but because the mind naturally speaks in the grammar of persons. When the world hurts, it can feel as if it means to hurt. When it provides, it can feel as if it chose to provide. But private impressions do not become tradition by themselves. Religion, as it emerges in the record, becomes communal, coordinated, repeated, taught. That shift points to another pressure. The problem of living with more people than one can truly know. In small bands, trust is intimate. In wider networks, trade, seasonal gatherings, alliances, cooperation becomes fragile. Shared stories can act like social technology. Shared taboos reduce conflict. Shared ceremonies synchronize bodies. Shared moral narratives extend us beyond kin. When people began to stay longer in one place, the pressure sharpened. Settlement turns land into identity. It creates storage, inheritance, and new reasons to fear loss. In the Epipaleolithic and early Neolithic Near East, communities show burials that keep the dead close, and later practices sometimes reshape skulls as if ancestors should remain present in the household. Interpretations vary. Status, lineage, mourning made material. But the direction is suggestive. The dead stop being distant. They become architecture. And then there is Göbekli Tepe, heavy and puzzling, towering pillars carved with animals arranged in circles, built very early near the threshold of farming. It complicates the older story in which agriculture creates surplus, and surplus creates temples. Here, a monumental ritual centre seems to appear before the classic signs of states. Some scholars propose that gathering for feasting and ceremony helped drive organisation that later supported farming. If so, shared meaning may have been an engine capable of moving stone. Yet Göbekli Tepe refuses to confess what it meant. Ancestors, spirits, clan emblems, cosmology. Each explanation fits the carvings, and none can be proven from stone alone. The site demonstrates something simpler and more unsettling. People believed coordination through the unseen was worth immense labour. From there, another shadow approaches the question: power. As societies grow, stories do not merely comfort, they organise. Later priesthoods and states will standardise myths, enforce calendars, and make memory official. Once a story is written, it becomes easier to police. Once it is policed, it becomes harder to recall that alternatives existed. The past narrows into an authorised corridor, and everything outside it becomes silence. So the original mystery turns double-edged. Religion may have begun as a response to death, and the mind's hunger for agency. It also became a tool capable of reshaping what later generations are allowed to remember. Did religion emerge from fear of dying, or from refusal to let the dead vanish? From cognitive bias, or from the social need to bind strangers into one breathing rhythm? And if the earliest impulse was simply the mind speaking to absence, when did absence stop being a private ache and become a public instrument? Until the unseen no longer felt like a companion, but like an authority that watches. A strange thing happens when the unseen becomes familiar. It stops being a vague presence at the edge of fear and starts to feel like a neighbour. Sometimes helpful, sometimes unpredictable, but somehow addressable. And once something feels addressable, humans begin to test it. They repeat actions, they listen for outcomes, they build a private logic out of coincidence, a logic that can survive even when it fails, because it can always be explained as displeasure, timing, impurity, or misunderstanding. That is one of the quiet engines behind religion, the mind's willingness to treat uncertainty as conversation. In landscapes where hunger and danger arrived without warning, people learned to watch patterns. The same cognitive machinery that made tracking possible also made meaning possible. A footprint in mud, a broken twig, a shift in wind. These were not data in any modern sense. They were hints. And when the mind is trained to survive on hints, it becomes skilled at building stories that connect them. Not stories as entertainment, but stories as navigation. This is where the invisible agents begin to multiply. The forest does not merely contain animals, it contains intentions. The river does not only flow, it can refuse. The sky does not only change, it can threaten. Some researchers describe this as a bias toward agency detection, a readiness to assume someone rather than something. It is not childishness. It is a survival strategy that becomes, under certain pressures, a metaphysical habit. In the beginning, the agents do not need to be gods. They can be almost like weather with a face, a presence in the hunt, a mood in the cave, a feeling that certain places listen more than others. Even today, in many small-scale societies, Religious life can center on spirits that are local, relational, and specific, beings tied to a spring, a ridge, a family line, a particular danger. The older the human condition is imagined, the more likely religion began in this intimate register, not with a single grand creator, but with a crowded world. And crowded worlds require etiquette. Once a person believes there is an invisible witness, behavior shifts. Not always toward kindness, but toward caution, toward sequence and purity, toward rules that are difficult to justify in practical terms yet feel urgent. Anthropologists have long noticed how taboos, food restrictions, contact restrictions, ritual boundaries can organize social life, especially when resources are scarce or tensions are high. Some taboos may carry hidden practical benefits, others might be largely symbolic. Yet symbolism is not a weak force. Symbolism is how humans make invisible agreements visible. If a group shares a taboo, they share a boundary. If they share a boundary, they share a sense of us. And if they share a sense of us, strangers become less dangerous. There is another mechanism that steps in here almost unnoticed: costly commitment. A ritual that costs time, energy, or comfort can serve as proof that someone is truly invested. Some evolutionary and economic models suggest that costly religious behaviors, fasting, painful rites, long pilgrimages, extravagant offerings, can function as signals that cannot easily be faked. In communities where trust matters, costly signals reduce uncertainty. A person who endures a cost for a shared belief might be safer to rely on than a person who does not. Religion, in this sense, becomes a technology for reading sincerity. But that explanation alone cannot satisfy the deeper ache. Humans do not only coordinate, they mourn. They fear the blankness after death. They feel the weight of injustice, the way bad people sometimes thrive and good people sometimes vanish. If the universe is indifferent, then suffering is simply noise. Religion offers an alternative, suffering as message, trial, or balance. Not solution, but a shape. And once suffering has a shape, it can be endured. Yet the same move can be exploited. If suffering is interpreted as punishment, then authority can present itself as the interpreter, someone who knows why the unseen is angry, someone who knows how to fix it. Here, the mystery begins to darken, because the earliest religions may have been intimate and local, but later forms become organizational. The invisible is not only felt, it is managed. The transition may have started when human groups grew beyond what memory could comfortably hold. Cognitive anthropologists have suggested that there are limits to stable social relationships in large groups. When communities exceed those limits, they require structures to maintain cohesion, laws, institutions, shared myths. Religion can become one of those structures, especially when it provides a shared narrative that compresses complexity into moral clarity. The gods, or the spirits, become not only companions of nature but guardians of social order. This may be why the unseen begins to change character in the archaeological and historical record. Early, local spirits do not necessarily care about human morality. They might care about respect, offerings, boundaries. But as societies grow denser and conflicts become more expensive, a new kind of invisible authority becomes useful, one that cares about cheating, betrayal, theft, and broken promises. An unseen witness makes private behavior socially relevant. It reduces the temptation to exploit strangers when no one is watching, because someone is always watching. And yet, the earliest hints of this moralization are difficult to date. In prehistory, morality does not leave direct artifacts. What remains are architectural choices, repeated patterns, evidence of feasting, evidence of coordination, evidence of sacrifice. Even sacrifice is ambiguous. It can be gratitude, bargaining, fear, or tradition. It can be devotion, or a payment extracted by those who claim to speak for the unseen. The same act can hold tenderness and coercion in the same hand. One of the most unsettling possibilities is that religion did not simply appear, but accelerated when humans found themselves repeatedly facing disruptions they could not explain. Climate swings, droughts, sudden cold spells, unfamiliar diseases, violent encounters with outsiders. The late Pleistocene and early Holocene were not stable eras. They were times of shifting ecologies and rearranged lives. Under repeated shocks, the mind seeks patterns that restore a feeling of control. Ritual is control in slow motion. It allows a person to do something rather than sit helplessly beneath the sky. But control has a cost. It can turn into obsession, and obsession can be directed. Once a group believes the unseen must be appeased, anyone who claims to know how becomes valuable. That value can harden into rank. Rank can harden into class. Class can harden into history written by the winners. The invisible becomes a ladder. This is how the gentle question, "Why did humans create religion?" begins to sound like another question hiding behind it. Who benefited when religion became organized? The answer cannot be reduced to villains. Humans are rarely that simple. Organizing belief can stabilize life, coordinate care, create art, build calendars, preserve knowledge. It can also justify conquest, silence dissent, and rewrite memory. The same flame that warms can also burn. And the most disquieting thought is that the first step toward both outcomes might have been something as ordinary as a mind mistaking patterns for intention. A rustle interpreted as a watcher, a coincidence interpreted as a sign, a ritual repeated because it once worked, a story told to calm a child, then retold until it becomes a rule. In the next layer of fog, the question narrows further into the body itself, the places where humans discovered that consciousness can change. Darkness, rhythm, hunger, breath, echo, conditions that can summon visions without any external spirit at all, while still feeling like contact with something beyond the self. If the earliest gods arrived through the nervous system, would anyone have been able to tell the difference? The unseen does not always arrive as an idea. Sometimes it arrives as a sensation, an alteration in breath, a tightening in the chest, a sudden conviction that a presence has stepped into the room even though the room is empty. Long before formal doctrine, humans would have known these moments, not as psychology, not as neurology, but as the simplest and most persuasive kind of evidence, the body insisting that something is real. And there are places in the deep past where the body seems to have been guided toward exactly that insistence. Caves are not only dark, they are acoustic instruments. Sound in certain chambers swells, repeats, becomes a second voice. Footsteps can feel like they belong to someone behind you. A whispered phrase can return altered, as if the cave is answering. Researchers who study archaeoacoustics have explored how some painted spaces correspond to resonant points, suggesting that prehistoric artists may have been sensitive to the way certain locations behaved when voices or percussion entered them. Even if such correlations are imperfect, the principle stands. The environment can amplify the sense of presence. Add flickering torchlight and fatigue, and perception bends. Shadows become motion. Still images appear to breathe. A painted bison seems to step forward and then vanish. The wall becomes a membrane rather than a barrier. It is not difficult to imagine how, in such conditions, a mind trained to detect agency would feel watched. Not in the paranoid sense, but in the intimate sense, a feeling that the world is not inert. That feeling can be soothing. It can also be terrifying. And both emotions are fertile ground for ritual, because ritual is what humans do when they need to stabilize the unstable. Anthropology has long described religious specialists, often called shamans in comparative literature, who mediate between ordinary reality and other states. The term is complicated and sometimes misused, but the cross-cultural pattern remains. Many societies develop roles for people who enter trance, interpret visions, and bring back guidance for the community. Trance can be induced by drumming, chanting, dancing, fasting, isolation, pain, psychoactive plants, or the simple monotony of repetitive sound. The methods differ, but the effect is often similar. The sense of self becomes porous, and experience feels as though it is coming from elsewhere. To a modern observer, such states can be described in terms of brain activity and perception. To a prehistoric observer, they could feel like the clearest proof imaginable that another layer of reality exists. This is a quiet possibility. Religion may have been shaped as much by altered consciousness as by fear of death. In other words, humans did not only invent gods to explain suffering, they encountered states of mind that felt like contact, and then built social meaning around those encounters. It is worth noticing how persuasive the mind can be to itself. The brain can generate voices, presences, and images without external stimuli, especially under stress or deprivation. Sleep paralysis, for example, can produce a vivid sensation of an intruder, a weight on the chest, a presence that feels malicious or holy depending on cultural framing. Such experiences occur across cultures and have been interpreted in countless ways. Demons, spirits, ancestors, extraterrestrials. The raw phenomenon is similar. The story changes. This hints at a deeper structure. Religion may not begin as a set of beliefs. It may begin as a set of experiences, and belief is the community's way of naming them. When experiences are rare and intense, they become valuable. When they are valuable, communities seek to reproduce them. When they seek to reproduce them, they develop techniques, and technique becomes tradition. Over time, tradition becomes authority. Some people are recognized as better intermediaries than others. Those intermediaries hold power, not necessarily because they are deceitful, but because people truly need them. A community facing drought or disease will cling to anyone who seems able to speak with the unseen. Yet this is where another fracture opens. If the unseen can be accessed through the nervous system, it can also be manipulated through social suggestion. The human mind is exquisitely responsive to expectation. If a group believes a certain chant summons a presence, participants may genuinely feel that presence, not because they are pretending, but because perception is shaped by context. The line between authentic experience and socially induced experience is not clean, and that ambiguity creates a vulnerable space where control can take root. Some researchers have argued that the earliest monumental ritual sites could have served as theatres for such experiences. Architecture that overwhelms scale, that directs movement, that gathers people into synchronized emotion. The body responds to mass coordination. Heart rates align. Breathing becomes rhythmic. Fear and awe become shared. In such states, individuals can feel absorbed into something larger, and that absorption can be interpreted as divine contact. If so, then religion's rise may be partly an engineering of atmosphere, long before engineering was called engineering. Consider again the question of why humans would labour for sacred spaces. A hunting band can move freely. Why anchor meaning to stone? One answer is practical: storage, land rights, defence. Another answer is emotional: the desire to return to the place where something happened, where a vision arrived, where the dead feel near, where a promise was made. A site becomes a memory externalized, and memory externalized becomes obligation. But there is also a darker possibility that slips behind these answers. Once a sacred place is established, it can be used to standardize experience. People come, participate, and leave with similar sensations and similar stories. Over generations, those stories can be shaped, edited, disciplined. What begins as private wonder becomes public script, and the public script can be inherited by institutions. This is not yet the era of written texts. It is the era of performance, chant, myth, gesture, taboo, feast. Performance can preserve information with remarkable fidelity, but it can also smuggle in power. If only certain people are allowed to perform the central rites, they become gatekeepers of meaning. If only certain interpretations are permitted, the unseen begins to resemble a court rather than a wilderness. The shift is subtle. Early spirits feel like weather with faces. Later spirits feel like administrators of fate. Still, the prehistoric record does not let anyone speak too confidently. It offers glimpses rather than declarations. The best one can do is notice converging pressures. Environmental instability, expanding social networks, cognitive biases toward agency, and the powerful reality of altered states. Together, they create a world where religion is not an invention, but an emergent property, a pattern rising from many small needs. And yet, something remains unresolved. If religion is partly born from altered states, why do so many traditions converge on similar images? Journeys to an underworld, meetings with ancestors, battles with monstrous beings, voices that instruct, lights that judge. Are these universal brain patterns, or do they reflect older stories passing between peoples long before writing, carried along trade routes like invisible seeds? The next layer of fog will move from caves and bodies to households and bones, toward the moment when the dead cease to be only mourned and begin to be curated. When skulls are handled, faces are remade, and ancestry becomes not just memory, but infrastructure. If the dead were the first invisible citizens, what kind of society did they build among the living? In a world without paper, without photographs, without permanent names carved into stone, the dead could vanish with frightening ease. A body returns to soil, a voice fades, and the living are left with only the unreliable architecture of memory. For people who relied on oral knowledge, roots, seasons, kin obligations, forgetting was not merely sad, forgetting was dangerous. So it is tempting to see the earliest religious impulses not as theology, but as a technology of remembrance, a way to keep the past present enough to guide the present. Archaeology begins to catch a clearer scent of this when humans settle, even partially. The shift toward a longer-term dwelling changes how time feels. When a group moves constantly, the landscape holds memory. When a group stays, the home must hold it. The house becomes a container not only for grain and tools, but for lineage, debt and grief. In parts of the Near East during the early Neolithic, burials appear under floors, inside living spaces. The dead were not always exiled to a separate realm. They remained close, literally beneath the places where daily life unfolded. Scholars read this in several ways: a claim over land, an anchor for ancestry, a practice of continuing bonds. Each interpretation differs, yet all point toward the same stubborn fact. Death was brought into the centre, not pushed to the edge. In some sites, the treatment of skulls becomes especially striking. Skulls were sometimes removed after decomposition, then replastered, painted, or shaped into faces. Eyes might be emphasised, features restored. The result is neither simple mortuary practice nor mere art. It is an attempt to make a person persist. The face is the most persuasive human symbol of presence. To rebuild a face is to rebuild a listener. A listener can become a witness. Here, religion begins to look less like an explanation for thunder, and more like a negotiation with social reality. As communities grow, more disputes, more inheritance, more strangers passing through, ancestry can serve as law. If the ancestors are near, behaviour is accountable. If the ancestors are watching, private choices become public in the deepest possible sense. Even without big gods, the dead can enforce continuity. There is also something intimate in this nearness. Grief is not only sorrow, it is refusal of erasure. In many cultures, the dead remain participants in family life through offerings and story. The idea that the dead remain invested can be comforting. It turns the family into a project that extends beyond a single lifespan, but comfort and control travel together. If misfortune can be read as an ancestor's displeasure, then someone must interpret the message. Illness becomes warning. A bad harvest becomes a sign. Once suffering has meaning, the search for transgression can become severe. Purity rules, accusations, scapegoats. The ancestors, once tender continuity, can be recruited into discipline. This is why the prehistoric record feels morally ambiguous. The same mechanisms that create care can create suspicion. The same rites that bind people can exclude them. The same sacred story that protects the group can justify harm against anyone framed as a threat to the story. Still, the evidence suggests that early ritual life was often woven into ordinary existence rather than separated into grand institutions. A house floor becomes a grave, a hearth becomes a boundary, a lineage becomes a map of obligations. Religion in this phase is not cathedral, it is a rhythm. Repeated practices train attention. A child raised in a home where certain corners are avoided because an ancestor lies beneath will grow up inside a moral landscape. If certain foods are offered or withheld on specific days, time becomes textured. If stories about the dead are told in specific tones, the night becomes inhabited. Over generations, these textures can thicken into cosmology without anyone consciously deciding to build a cosmology. Between these household practices and later monuments, there are liminal forms that feel like bridges. At Jericho, for example, early walls and a tower appear astonishingly ancient, and scholars still debate how much was defensive, how much was communal identity, how much was symbolic. At Çatalhöyük, houses press against each other like cells, and art, burials and daily work intermingle so tightly that religious space becomes hard to separate from living space. These places hint that sacred life could be everywhere at once, embedded in plaster, in paint, in the arrangement of rooms, before it ever became a single building set apart. Yet outside the house, another pressure rises. Scale, population increases, settlements link into networks, trade and conflict extend beyond kin. A purely local witness becomes insufficient. Trust must stretch between strangers who do not share grandparents. The invisible audience must scale up. One can feel that pressure in the way sacred spaces begin to stand apart from homes. Gathering places become more specialized. Symbols repeat across sites. The story that once belonged to a household begins to belong to a region. In that widening, the dead are still present, but they are no longer enough. New beings appear, less intimate, more abstract, more powerful. And with those beings comes an uneasy possibility. Religion's expansion is not only a response to mystery, but a response to administration. The more a society must manage people, the more it benefits from shared rules that feel inevitable. An ancestor can advise, but a god can command. An ancestor can be negotiated with, but a god can legislate. If this is true, then religion did not begin once. It kept being reinvented at each new scale of human life, first as grief, then as household continuity, then as regional coordination, and finally as institutional authority. But a final doubt refuses to settle. When skulls are replastered and placed back among the living, is this evidence of belief in an afterlife, or evidence of something colder? The use of the dead as proof of legitimacy. Are the ancestors being honoured or being used? The next layer will follow that doubt into stone and monument, toward the moment when ritual stops fitting inside a house and begins to demand a landscape. What happens when the sacred is no longer under the floor, but on the hill, visible to everyone and therefore available to anyone who wants to claim it? When the sacred moves out of the house and into the open, it begins to change its tone. A household rite can remain intimate, ambiguous and forgiving, its meanings held in family memory, its boundaries negotiated by those who share meals. But a hilltop sanctuary, a stone circle, a towering pillar field, cannot belong to one family. It belongs to a crowd. And crowds do not remember in the same way individuals do. Crowds need repetition, spectacle, and a story broad enough to hold people who do not share blood. This is where religion begins to resemble architecture for the mind. Göbekli Tepe stands at the edge of this transformation like a silent witness. It is not the only early ritual complex, but it has become a symbol, because it arrives so early with such scale. The pillars are heavy with effort, carved with animals that seem less like decoration and more like a vocabulary. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds, figures that could be read as clans, dangers, myths, or guardians. The T-shapes have been interpreted as stylized human forms, yet they are faceless, as if personhood has become abstract. The site does not announce a doctrine, it announces coordination. Coordination is expensive. It requires scheduling, leadership, shared food, and shared purpose. And shared purpose is rarely maintained by practicality alone. People will gather for trade, yes, but trade does not usually demand monumental stone. Monument suggests something that must be felt, not merely done. Something that must be experienced together so it can become unquestionable. One hypothesis that has circulated in scholarly discussion is that large ritual gatherings could have accelerated social complexity in ways that made agriculture more likely. If many groups return to a central sanctuary seasonally, they need predictable supplies. They might begin managing wild cereals more intensively, storing food and organizing labor. Over time, the ritual calendar could become an economic calendar. In this view, religion is not a byproduct of surplus. It is one of the machines that creates surplus by concentrating people into repeated patterns. Yet even if that model is partly true, it leaves a deeper question untouched. What kind of psychological force convinces humans to lift stones for beings they cannot see? A possible answer lies in the way public ritual produces certainty. When 100 bodies move together, singing, fasting, feasting, processing through a space designed to overwhelm scale, doubt becomes socially difficult. The individual mind can question, but the group mind feels, and feeling is persuasive, or compresses complexity into a single sensation. Something is bigger than the self. Something must be obeyed. In such spaces, symbols become shared reference points. An animal carved into stone can carry multiple meanings at once: danger, ancestor, food, myth, spirit. Ambiguity is not a flaw, it is an advantage. It allows many people to agree emotionally, even when they disagree intellectually. A symbol that is too precise fractures the crowd. A symbol that is broad holds it. Over time, the broad symbol invites specialization. Someone begins to explain it more often than others. Someone begins to lead the sequence. Someone becomes responsible for keeping the right rhythm, the right words, the right offerings. Authority grows quietly out of logistics, and logistics, once established, tends to justify itself. The person who knows the right becomes necessary, and necessity becomes power. This is the moment where religion can tilt from shared mystery toward managed mystery. Managed mystery does not always look oppressive. It can look like reassurance. It can look like a calendar that prevents chaos, a set of shared practices that reduce violence, a story that gives grief a shape and fear a boundary. But the same management can also create a gate, insiders who know, outsiders who do not, and once there is a gate, there can be a toll. Archaeology offers hints of feasting around ritual sites, large-scale consumption, animal remains suggesting gatherings beyond a single household. Feasts can be joyful. They can also be political. The person who distributes food controls loyalty. The person who hosts a rite can define belonging. Religion and economy begin to braid together so tightly that separating them becomes impossible. And then comes another shadow: sacrifice. Sacrifice can begin as offering, an attempt to give back to forces that sustain life. Yet in many historical societies, sacrifice also becomes a way to display commitment and hierarchy. The more costly the offering, the more serious the devotion appears. This can stabilize trust among believers, but it can also escalate demands. Once a community believes that the unseen requires cost, those who interpret the unseen can always argue that the cost must increase, especially during crisis. Crisis is where managed mystery becomes most powerful. Drought, disease, conflict. These are moments when people want certainty more than truth. They want a reason, a remedy, an enemy. Religion can provide all three: a narrative of why suffering occurs, a ritual to address it, and sometimes a target to blame for disrupting sacred order. This sanctuary that once gathered diverse groups can, under pressure, become a machine for exclusion. This is not speculation about human cruelty. It is a pattern that later history will make explicit, again and again, across empires and centuries. But even in prehistory, one can feel the conditions forming: larger populations, greater vulnerability to shock, increasing need for coordination, and the human tendency to seek meaning in misfortune. Still, Göbekli Tepe and its cousins do not hand over a confession. They do not say whether the first leaders were caretakers of wonder or early architects of control. They only show that humans were willing to gather for something beyond immediate survival, and that they used animals, stone, and spatial design to make the beyond feel present. A further complication deepens the fog. Some of the earliest monumental sites were later deliberately buried, as if someone decided to end them. Göbekli Tepe itself appears to have been backfilled in antiquity. Scholars debate why: practical abandonment, intentional closure, social transformation. Intentional closure is especially haunting because it suggests that ritual systems can be turned off, not just by forgetting, but by choice. If a sacred system can be buried, then it can be replaced, and if it can be replaced, then origins become political. Whoever controls the new sanctuary can claim the old one never mattered, or claim it only mattered as a prelude to their own truth. This raises an unsettling thought that will not fade. Religion's beginning is not one beginning. It is a series of beginnings, each one layered over the last. Each new scale of society demands a new kind of sacred structure, and each structure can overwrite the previous memory of how things used to be. So the question shifts slightly, growing sharper. It is no longer only why humans began creating religion. It becomes why humans keep recreating religion in forms that become easier to govern. In the next layer, the focus will move toward the moralization of the unseen, toward the moment when spirits stop being merely powerful and start being judgmental. When invisible beings begin to care not only about offerings and boundaries, but about theft, betrayal, sex, honesty, and the private intentions of the heart. How did the sacred become a courtroom? Somewhere along the long curve of human belief, the unseen changes its job description. It is one thing to fear a spirit that lives in a river, a presence that must be respected like weather, capable of harm, capable of help, but largely indifferent to whether humans are honest or cruel. It is another thing entirely to fear a presence that watches the inner life, that cares about hidden choices, that punishes not only theft but intention. That shift is so consequential that it almost feels like a second invention of religion, and it invites a quiet suspicion. Moral gods may have risen not only from awe, but from social necessity. In small, face-to-face groups, morality is enforced by visibility. Everyone knows who shares meat and who hoards it. Everyone knows who abandons others and who returns. Reputation is not abstract, it is a daily sensation. But as communities expand into settlements, networks, and trade routes, the old system weakens. Strangers appear. Deals happen beyond the village edge. Cheating becomes easier. Distrust becomes expensive. Under those conditions, an invisible witness becomes a powerful idea, not because it is proven, but because it is useful. If a person believes that hidden acts are still seen, then hidden betrayal becomes riskier. If a person believes that punishment can arrive from beyond human courts, then even the powerful are, in theory, constrained. The unseen becomes a supplement to law at the very moment when law is struggling to exist. This is the logic behind a family of hypotheses sometimes called moralizing gods or big gods theories in the study of cultural evolution. Some researchers argue that beliefs in supernatural punishment helped large-scale cooperation emerge by discouraging selfishness among strangers. Others challenge the timing and the universality, noting that complex societies existed with less morally focused deities, and that moralization can arise in different ways. The disagreement matters because it reminds the listener that religion's evolution is not a single straight line. It branches, it loops, it reverses. Still, even if the details vary, the pressure is easy to feel. When a community grows beyond memory, it must externalize memory. Rules must be spoken, repeated, enforced. And the most effective rules are those that feel anchored to something unarguable. A god can make a rule feel heavier than any human voice. But the same mechanism that stabilizes cooperation also creates a lever for control. If morality is linked to invisible surveillance, then anyone who claims to interpret the surveillance gains an advantage. A priest does not need to threaten personally if the cosmos is already threatening. The community disciplines itself. It can begin gently. A taboo around food, framed as respect for a spirit, might reduce conflict or prevent illness. A purity rule around contact might lower disease transmission, even if its original logic is symbolic. Yet purity rules also classify people. They create categories, clean and unclean, permitted and forbidden, inside and outside. Once categories exist, exclusion becomes not merely social but sacred. This is one reason religion often grows sharper edges as societies become denser. Density increases friction. Friction increases anxiety. Anxiety seeks boundaries. Sacrifice, too, changes in this environment. An offering can be gratitude, but it can also become a test. The community watches who gives. The cost becomes proof. Some models suggest that costly rituals function as signals of commitment. Those who will not pay are suspected of disloyalty. The sacred becomes a visible ledger of belonging, and ledger thinking naturally invites accounting. One can almost sense the coming of bureaucracy in the way moral religion develops. Time becomes regulated by festivals, bodies are regulated by purity, speech is regulated by oath, relationships are regulated by kin rules, violence is regulated by sanctioned enemies. The invisible witness is not only spiritual, it is administrative. Yet religion does not become moral simply because leaders desire control. Moral religion also answers a human wound that law alone cannot heal, the wound of unfairness. Life does not distribute suffering according to desert. Children die, the wicked prosper. Storms crush the careful and spare the careless. Without any cosmic narrative, injustice is not only painful, it is meaningless. Moral religion offers meaning, even if the meaning is harsh. It can say that suffering is punishment, or trial, or correction, or debt. Each explanation is psychologically potent. It gives the mind something to do. Repent, endure, hope, bargain. Meaning is not always comforting, but it is almost always preferable to blankness. Still, meaning can become obsession. If misfortune is punishment, then someone must be at fault. And once blame enters, it does not always stop at the guilty. It can spill onto outsiders, deviants, dissenters. It can settle on the vulnerable. The unseen witness becomes a searchlight. This is where the rise of moral religion becomes inseparable from the rise of social anxiety. As humans began storing grain, claiming land, inheriting property and recording lineage, they also created new kinds of sin. Theft against owners, betrayal against contracts, impurity against boundaries. A hunting ban can dissolve a conflict by moving away. A settlement cannot. It must live with its own tensions. Moral gods may have been one way to keep the lid on, but there is another haunting possibility, that moral religion intensified after shocks. periods of scarcity, warfare, or collapse, when communities became convinced that disorder itself was a spiritual infection. Under stress, people seek tighter rules. They seek scapegoats. They seek rituals that promise restoration. They demand certainty, and certainty, once demanded, can be produced. This is the subtle danger of organised morality. It can be shaped to fit whatever a dominant group needs at the time: stricter purity during epidemic, stricter obedience during war, stricter hierarchy during expansion. The unseen witness can be recruited into politics without ever admitting it has been recruited. All of this might sound bleak, but the record also suggests another side. Moral religion can generate genuine altruism, care for strangers, and sacrifice of self for group survival. It can create hospitals, charity, and mutual aid. It can restrain violence by making it taboo. It can bind people into ethical communities when state institutions are weak. So the question does not become good or bad. It becomes, why does the sacred so often become a mirror for the social problem of the era? And that mirror grows more reflective as writing arrives. Because once a moral code is written, it can outlive the people who created it. It can be transported. It can be imposed. It can be archived, edited, and used as evidence that a particular order has always existed. In the next layer of fog, the unseen witness will gain a new tool: text. Not merely stories told by firelight, but words fixed in clay, in stone, in ink, words that can be carried across empires. When memory becomes script, who gets to hold the script, and what happens to everyone whose sacred life was never written down? Writing does something subtle to the sacred. It does not merely preserve a belief, it changes the shape of belief. A spoken story lives in breath and social context. It adapts, it softens, it shifts with the needs of the moment. A written story can be pointed to. It can be corrected. It can be weaponized. Once words are fixed, memory is no longer only a living river. It becomes a container, something that can be owned. And ownership is where religion begins to resemble a state, even before the state admits it is a state. The earliest writing systems were not invented to record prayers. They were invented to count grain, livestock, labour, tribute. The first marks are often administrative, practical, almost cold. Yet administration and religion share a hunger. Both want to make the invisible visible. The state wants to make obligation visible. Religion wants to make meaning visible. When both begin using the same tool, written record, the overlap becomes intimate. Temples in many early urban societies were not only places of worship, they were economic hubs. They stored goods, they organised labour, they distributed rations. They maintained calendars that regulated planting, harvest, and festivals. In such contexts, the boundary between serving the gods and serving the institution can be difficult to trace. The gods become the language through which the institution speaks. A calendar, once sacred, can regulate bodies without needing constant violence. Work days, holy days, fasting periods, festival obligations, time itself becomes moral. To disobey is not merely to resist authority, it is to offend the cosmos. This is an efficient kind of control because it recruits guilt, and guilt is portable. A person carries it alone. But writing does something else as well. It creates the possibility of canon. A canon is not simply a collection of stories. It is a boundary drawn around what counts as true, and the act of drawing that boundary implies an excluded outside, stories that are wrong, dangerous, impure, or simply inconvenient. In oral cultures, exclusion happens, but it is softer and more porous. In literate cultures, exclusion can become permanent. A story that is not copied can die. A story that is condemned can be erased. A story that survives only in fragments can later be dismissed as myth, even if it once shaped entire regions. So the sacred begins to develop an archive problem. Who writes? Who copies? Who stores? Who decides which words are read aloud and which are buried? The moment those questions exist, religion is no longer only a response to mystery. It becomes a struggle over memory itself. This is where the earlier suspicion returns with sharper teeth. If religion began as fog, half grief, half awe, half cognitive habit, then writing can turn fog into architecture. It can declare clean origins where none existed. It can present a complex, disputed past as a single narrative line. It can erase the messy layers that came before. And if clean origins can be declared, clean authority can be declared with them. Priestly classes become custodians of the written sacred. Custodianship can be sincere and protective. It can also be monopolistic. When literacy is restricted, the sacred text becomes a gate. People must rely on interpreters. Interpreters become powerful, not because they invented belief, but because they control access to the form belief now takes. At this stage, an invisible witness becomes more than a watcher. The witness becomes a judge with precedent. Written codes allow moral rules to become standardized across distance. They can extend cooperation beyond kin, yes, but they also extend obedience. A person can be governed by a law written by someone they will never meet, justified by a deity they cannot question. The sacred becomes scalable, and yet scaling always costs something. Local spirits, local ancestor practices, local rituals that once fit a landscape often become marginalized. They are recast as superstition, idolatry, barbarism. The old sacred becomes wrong, not necessarily because it is false, but because it is uncontrollable. This is how an empire can expand not only territory, but reality. One can see the traces historically in how conquering powers absorb, rename, or suppress local cults. Sometimes gods are merged, sometimes temples are repurposed, sometimes languages are replaced, and with them the subtle meanings that lived in prayer. Official religion can present itself as universal, while quietly feeding on the bones of what came before. Archaeology finds this indirectly. Layers of rebuilding, shrines replaced by larger shrines, iconography altered, inscriptions appearing where once there were none. Even when a tradition is not fully erased, it can be disciplined, its meanings reinterpreted so that the centre remains the centre. And the most haunting part is that once written, the new narrative can claim to be ancient. It can look backward and declare that it has always been so. People born into the new order will not feel the replacement. Replacement becomes their baseline reality. In such a world, the question, why did humans begin creating religion, begins to blur into another. How many religions began, and how many were later edited into one? This is not mere cynicism. It is a recognition that memory is contested terrain. Even modern scholarship grapples with it. Texts survive unevenly, often preserved by the very institutions they describe. Archaeological evidence is partial and mute. Oral traditions can persist but be dismissed by literate elites. The past is not only what happened, it is what was allowed to remain. And yet, something persists beneath every archive. The human experience that made religion plausible in the first place. Awe, fear, grief, moral longing, altered states, the sense of presence in absence. No amount of bureaucracy can fully eliminate those roots. It can only channel them. So religion becomes both a river and a dam. It flows from human psychology and social need, and it is shaped by institutions that want to control its direction. The dam can create stability. It can also flood what lies upstream. In the next layer of fog, the focus will shift to the moment when religion becomes explicit political legitimacy, when kings rule by the gods, when conquest becomes sacred duty, and when the divine witness becomes a banner carried into war. If the unseen can govern private conscience, what happens when it is made to govern armies? There is a point in the human story when the sacred stops hovering above society and begins to sit inside the throne. The gods are no longer only invoked at the edge of fear or at the bedside of grief. They are invoked in proclamations, carved into monuments, stamped into law. The invisible witness becomes a witness for power. And once power is sacred, resistance becomes more than disagreement. It becomes blasphemy. In early states, legitimacy is a problem that never sleeps. A king can command soldiers, but soldiers need reason to obey beyond immediate reward. A ruler can seize grain, but famine breeds anger, and anger breeds revolt. To hold a society together, authority must appear inevitable. Religion can provide inevitability because it shifts the source of power from human choice to cosmic order. If a ruler is chosen by the gods, then the ruler's rule is not merely political, it is natural. This is why divine kingship appears in many forms across ancient civilizations. It can be literal, ruler as god, or it can be functional, ruler as the god's representative. The details differ, but the function converges. The sacred becomes an argument that cannot be debated in ordinary terms. The ruler is not simply strong. The ruler is aligned with the structure of reality. At first glance, this can look like manipulation, but it can also be an honest social invention born from the need to coordinate large populations. The more complex the society, the more essential it becomes to synchronize labor, irrigation schedules, planting cycles, construction projects, taxation. Sacred calendars and temple institutions can make that synchronization feel meaningful rather than merely coercive. A canal becomes not only engineering, but devotion. A harvest becomes not only yield, but cosmic renewal. The risk is that meaning can be extracted like tax. When the sacred sits in the throne, the line between offering and tribute blurs. Festivals can be both celebration and obligation. Sacrifice can be both prayer and payment. The temple can be both sanctuary and storehouse. The people can be both worshippers and workforce, and the invisible witness, once embedded in governance, becomes frighteningly efficient. Human surveillance is costly. Divine surveillance is cheap because it is internalized. The ruler does not need to see every act if the gods are believed to see. The ruler does not need to punish every deviation if fear and guilt do the work. But a more unsettling mechanism appears when the sacred becomes a banner for violence. Violence is easier when it can be framed as duty. A raid can be justified as righteous punishment. A conquest can be framed as cosmic correction. An enemy can be cast not only as a threat, but as impure, cursed, outside the moral universe. Religion can turn political conflict into metaphysical conflict, which is harder to resolve because compromise becomes betrayal of the divine. This is not unique to any one tradition. It is a human pattern, the unseen used to intensify the seen. Yet the story is not simply religion causes war. People fight for land, water, trade routes, prestige. Religion often enters as narrative glue, binding motivations into a single moral story that ordinary people can accept. The most dangerous part is that once the story is accepted, the war becomes emotionally clean. Doubt becomes weakness. Mercy becomes contamination. The enemy becomes less human. At the same time, sacred frameworks can also restrain violence by ritualizing it, limiting times, rules, prohibitions. The same sacred order that can justify conquest can also establish taboo against certain acts. This duality is one reason religion survives so many historical transformations. It can be used to intensify and to constrain, to unify and to divide, depending on who holds interpretation. Interpretation becomes the true battlefield. When texts exist, interpretation can be institutionalized. Priests, scribes, and later theologians can mediate between ruler and people. Sometimes they become checks on power. Sometimes they become its engine. The relationship between political authority and religious authority can be cooperative, competitive, or fused. In many cases, the two become indistinguishable. and that indistinguishability allows history to be rewritten smoothly. A political victory becomes a divine endorsement. A political loss becomes divine punishment. Either way, the sacred story remains intact, and the sacred story, once intact, can absorb contradiction. This is perhaps one of religion's most enduring strengths. It can incorporate catastrophe without breaking. Drought becomes a test. Plague becomes purification. Defeat becomes a lesson. Collapse becomes prophecy fulfilled. Such framing can help societies endure trauma, but it can also prevent societies from learning practical lessons, because misfortune is attributed to moral failure rather than environmental reality. Here, the earlier theme of resets returns. In human history, collapses occur. Cities abandoned, trade networks broken, populations reduced, knowledge lost. After collapse, people search for explanations. Religion can become the structure that carries memory across the gap, but it can also become the story that covers the gap. In the aftermath of trauma, the human mind often prefers a narrative with intention. It prefers that someone, somewhere, meant something by the devastation. If catastrophe is interpreted as punishment, then those in power can argue for stricter obedience. Crisis becomes an excuse to tighten control. The unseen witness becomes a whip, and yet catastrophe can also open cracks through which alternative sacred visions emerge. When official religion fails to protect, people turn toward new prophets, new cults, new forms of devotion. The sacred throne can be challenged by sacred outsiders. Over time, these outsiders may become the next institution, and the cycle repeats. New revelation becomes new canon becomes new control. So the question shifts again, deeper into the machinery of memory. If religion can legitimize power, then power has incentive to curate religion. Certain texts are copied, certain rituals are promoted, certain stories are declared central, others become heresy, superstition, or noise. What disappears in that process is not always false. It is often merely inconvenient. In the next layer of fog, attention will turn toward those disappearances, toward the heresies, rival cults, forbidden books, and silenced voices that once offered different answers to the same human wounds. If religion began as a way to speak into absence, what happens when some voices are forbidden from speaking at all? Not everything sacred survives. Some beliefs vanish without drama, fading as climates change, as villages move, as languages dissolve into new tongues. But other disappearances feel deliberate. Certain names are scratched away, certain shrines are dismantled, certain texts are burned, or quietly never copied again. The record of religion, once it becomes written and institutional, begins to show signs of editing, not only by time, but by intention. The unsettling part is that editing can be done with sincerity. A reformer may truly believe they are purifying the faith. A council may truly believe it is protecting the community from dangerous ideas. An empire may truly believe it is saving souls. The motive can be spiritual and still result in erasure. The victims of erasure can be wrong, or they can be inconveniently right, or they can simply be different. From the outside, the outcome looks the same. A corridor of sanctioned memory with doors locked behind it. This is where the question of origins becomes most fragile. If religion began as a scattered set of local practices and experiences, then later institutions had to choose among them. They had to define which stories were central and which were peripheral. And once a definition exists, it tends to retroactively claim that it was always true. The past is reorganized to fit the present. In many historical contexts, the formation of canon, deciding which texts count as scripture, was not merely a spiritual matter. It was also political, because texts guide behavior. They define authority. They shape family structure, property rights, moral boundaries, and the legitimacy of rulers. A text that encourages obedience will be safer for power than a text that encourages direct personal revelation. A text that centralizes priestly mediation will be safer than a text that claims the divine speaks to anyone. So texts are not only read, they are selected. The process is often visible only in its aftermath. What remains and what is known to have existed but did not survive. Fragments, quotations by opponents, references in marginal notes, ghost evidence that something else once breathed beside the dominant story. In the study of early Christianity, for example, non-canonical gospels and writings, some preserved at Nag Hammadi, others known only by references, show how varied early beliefs could be. Some emphasized secret knowledge, some emphasized visionary experience, some portrayed the divine in ways later orthodoxy rejected. The details are less important here than the pattern. Religious diversity often precedes religious uniformity, and uniformity often arrives through decision. Decision requires power. Sometimes power arrives as councils and creeds, sometimes as emperors and edicts, sometimes as gradual social pressure, sometimes it is violence, sometimes it is ridicule, sometimes it is simply the economics of copying. Before printing, text survived by being recopied. To copy is to choose is to privilege. The sacred archive is therefore not neutral. It is shaped by hands, and hands belong to institutions. This is why suppression can be quiet. A book does not always need to be burned, it only needs to be neglected. And neglect is often justified as protection. Certain ideas are framed as dangerous because they threaten unity. Unity is framed as necessary because society is fragile. Fragility is framed as proof that dissent is immoral. The logic forms a loop, and the loop can last centuries. Yet religion, in its earliest forms, may have been less about unity and more about coping with multiplicity. Many spirits, many forces, many local truths. A river spirit could coexist with a mountain spirit. An ancestor rite could coexist with a seasonal ceremony. Plural sacred worlds do not require one narrative line. They require tolerance for contradiction. Institutional religion often struggles with contradiction because contradiction destabilizes authority. That struggle produces heresy hunts, iconoclasm, reforms, purges. It produces language about purity, and purity language, once activated, does more than remove ideas. It removes people. It reframes neighbours as threats, not merely opponents. The sacred becomes a tool for social sorting. And still, the suppressed rarely disappear completely. They slip underground. They survive as folk practice, as whispered prayer, as amulets and songs, as symbolic gestures hidden inside sanctioned forms. The official religion becomes a mask worn over older layers. Archaeologists and historians sometimes find these layers in odd places, in syncretic iconography, in local saints that resemble older deities, in festivals that keep pre-institutional rhythms. Such survivals complicate the claim that religion is simply imposed from above. People do not accept sacred authority like a tax receipt. They adapt it. They weave it into their own needs. Even under strong institutions, personal religious life can remain messy, contradictory, tender. So the question becomes almost archaeological in a new sense. How much of religion's origin is truly origin, and how much is reconstruction by those who came later? It is here that conspiracy begins to hover, not as a cartoon villain story, but as a historically plausible mechanism. Institutions have incentives to control narrative. Empires have incentives to legitimize themselves. Priestly classes have incentives to protect their role. These incentives do not require a single secret meeting or a single mastermind. They require only continuity, a repeating pattern of selection, suppression, and reinterpretation. One might call it a system rather than a plot. The system's effect is that the earliest, most fragile forms of religion, personal visions, local spirits, household rites, are the easiest to erase because they leave fewer durable records. The forms that survive are those aligned with writing, administration, and power, the sacred that remains becomes the sacred that could be archived. And that is an unnerving filter. It means the religion people inherit might not be the religion that first emerged, but the religion that institutions could hold. This brings the story back to the beginning, to that thin line between experience and interpretation. If early religion was shaped by altered states, grief, agency detection, and social coordination, then later suppression may have systematically removed the most personal and destabilizing aspects: direct revelation, ecstatic experience, plural spirits, while preserving the parts that regulate behavior and unify groups. If so, then why did humans begin creating religion is inseparable from what kinds of religion were allowed to survive. In the next layer of fog, the investigation will widen beyond specific traditions to compare myths across continents. Floods, sky beings, underworld journeys, world trees. Are these shared memories of ancient catastrophes, shared patterns of the human brain, or signs that certain stories were spread and standardized long before writing, through networks older than most histories admit? Some stories behave like fossils. They appear in distant places in languages that never touched, among peoples who never shared an empire, yet their shapes feel eerily familiar. Floods that erase worlds, sky powers that descend and depart, underworld journeys where the living bargain with death, a first couple, a stolen fire, a tower or mountain that once touched heaven. The similarities are not perfect, but they are persistent enough to make the mind uneasy. Because the moment a pattern repeats across continents, the question changes. It is no longer only, what did people believe? It becomes, why do people keep believing in structures that rhyme? There are several ways to approach this without pretending certainty. One approach is psychological. Comparative mythologists and depth psychologists have argued that certain narrative motifs recur because human minds share similar fears and similar cognitive tendencies. The body is universal, so are dreams, so are the existential problems that haunt consciousness: mortality, injustice, the unpredictability of nature, the terror of isolation. From this perspective, mythic patterns are not evidence of a single lost source. They are evidence of shared human constraints. If the mind is built a certain way, it will generate certain symbols the way lungs generate breath. Another approach is historical diffusion. Humans have always moved more than textbooks once admitted. Trade routes, intermarriage, migration after drought, refugees after conflict, stories travel with them. A myth can cross a mountain in the mouth of a single person, then shift and adapt until its origin becomes invisible. Over centuries, shared motifs can emerge not because the myths were born identical, but because they were braided together in the long, invisible commerce of human contact. And then there is the approach that feels most haunting in the quiet hours: catastrophe memory. Flood myths are a prime example. Mesopotamian traditions, Atrahasis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, contain flood narratives that predate and parallel later biblical versions in broad outline. Scholars have long explored the relationships among these texts, the ways stories were inherited, adapted, and reinterpreted. Beyond the Near East, flood stories appear in many cultures, though not always in the same form. It is tempting to treat this as evidence of a single global cataclysm. But a more cautious view suggests something more complex. Floods are common human trauma, and coastal and riverine populations have always been vulnerable to sudden devastation. A flood story can be local, repeated, and then symbolically amplified until it becomes cosmic. Yet the temptation remains because the early Holocene did include dramatic environmental change: sea levels rising after the last glacial maximum, coastlines shifting, fertile plains drowning. Entire landscapes that hunter-gatherers once walked are now underwater. Those submerged worlds could have carried memories of loss, passed forward as stories of a world that ended. If religion is partly a response to loss, then flood myths could be loss made archetypal. And that brings a subtle implication. Myths might preserve not only fears, but history. History filtered through symbol, because symbol is easier to transmit than detail. A community may forget the exact year the waters rose, but remember the moral. Arrogance invited ruin, or the gods wiped the slate clean, or the world must be renewed through obedience. Here the concept of reset returns, not as a sensational claim, but as a recurring human intuition. Across cultures, there are stories in which the world is periodically destroyed and remade, ages of humanity, cycles of decline, purifications by fire or water. Even where such cycles are not literal beliefs, they appear as metaphors of social anxiety. The fear that order is fragile, that civilization can end, that memory can be erased. Religion often provides the grammar for that fear, but religion also provides the grammar for hope, that after erasure something remains, an ark, a seed, a covenant, a remnant, a survivor who carries the law into the new world. This is why shared myth patterns matter for the central question. They suggest religion may not have begun only as an explanation for nature, but as a strategy for carrying meaning across rupture. A myth is a container designed to survive when facts cannot. If a society collapses, the myth can still walk into the next society. And yet, even comparative patterns can be curated. Institutions can choose which myths to preserve, which to interpret as allegory, which to condemn. The same flood story can be framed as literal history, moral parable, or dangerous superstition depending on who holds power. So the similarity of myths does not automatically prove a single source, it proves something else. Humans are capable of converging on the same symbolic solutions, and humans are capable of borrowing and reshaping each other's solutions. Between convergence and diffusion lies another possibility that is easy to miss: selection. In cultural evolution, certain ideas survive because they fit cognitive preferences. A story that is easy to remember, emotionally charged, morally clear and socially useful will spread. Over time, these selection pressures can make myths in different places look more similar, even without direct contact. The most fit religious motifs reproduce. This means religion may have begun many times, but only certain forms tended to endure. Forms that explain misfortune, forms that reward obedience, forms that bind strangers, forms that promise cosmic justice, forms that place humans inside a moral universe rather than a random one. These forms satisfy deep needs and solve deep social problems. They also create deep opportunities for control. So the haunting pattern remains. Religion is both a beam and a harness. In the next layer of fog, the focus will tighten on rupture itself, on the real archaeological and climatological evidence for collapses, bottlenecks, and cultural discontinuities. If human societies repeatedly experience loss and reorganization, then religion might be less an invention of comfort and more a survival mechanism for memory. But if memory is the goal, why do so many religious systems also seem to forget, to erase, to condemn what came before? A civilization can vanish without leaving a single sentence explaining why. It can become an absence so complete that later people walk over the ruins and call them natural hills. This is not a romantic exaggeration. Archaeology is filled with discontinuities, layers of ash, abandoned streets, sudden changes in pottery styles, gaps in settlement patterns, and long stretches where a region seems to go quiet. Even when the reasons are mundane, drought, soil exhaustion, political conflict, the effect on memory is profound. The world breaks, and the story people tell afterward is rarely the full story. In those cracks, religion often grows, not because religion is always born from catastrophe, but because catastrophe creates the exact conditions in which humans crave a narrative strong enough to carry them across the void. When a familiar order collapses, the mind searches for explanation. If the collapse is framed as punishment, the community gains a reason to tighten itself. If the collapse is framed as a test, endurance becomes meaningful. If the collapse is framed as a cosmic cycle, then fear can be placed inside inevitability. Even hopelessness can be given structure. This is one reason religious systems are so adept at absorbing trauma. They provide a grammar for rupture. Yet rupture is not only traumatic, it is also politically useful. After collapse, new rulers appear, new elites form, new institutions step forward with promises of stability. In the chaos, people accept frameworks they might once have resisted. Religion can become the language through which the new order justifies itself. The gods demanded change, the old world was corrupt, the new law is purification. This is how a reset becomes a story of legitimacy. The archaeological record offers many contexts where such dynamics might have occurred. The end of the Late Bronze Age in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, saw widespread disruptions. Cities burned, trade networks fractured, writing systems faltered in some regions, and political orders shifted. Scholars debate the causes, complex interactions of climate stress, conflict, internal instability and migration. Whatever the cause, the result created a gap in which later societies rebuilt narratives about who they were and why the past had broken. In those rebuilt narratives, divine causation often appears because divine causation offers moral clarity. But the idea of rupture goes deeper than famous collapses. Even earlier, at the end of the Pleistocene, human communities faced significant environmental change. As glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, coastlines shifted, ecosystems rearranged. Entire ways of life became less reliable. In such times, old sacred geographies can disappear, coastal sites swallowed, river patterns altered, resource zones transformed. The sacred is forced to migrate. When sacred geography migrates, sacred memory is pressured to adapt. If a holy place is lost to water, a new place must be declared holy. If a ritual is tied to an animal that becomes scarce, a symbol must replace the animal. If a seasonal rhythm changes, the calendar must be rewritten. Over time, adaptation can look like innovation, and innovation can be mistaken for origin. So religion might not begin in a single burst. It might repeatedly begin again after each disruption, as if humans were reweaving a torn cloth. And yet, this reweaving comes with a cost. Every rewrite risks erasure. Here is the paradox. Religion often claims to preserve truth across generations, yet it can also be one of the most effective tools for forgetting. Not always forgetting facts, but forgetting alternatives. Forgetting rival sacred systems. Forgetting that different explanations once existed. Forgetting that authority was once negotiable. This is why institutional religion so often develops an allergy to pluralism. After rupture, unity feels like survival. A community that has been shattered may interpret disagreement as a threat to cohesion. The sacred story becomes a fence. Inside the fence, people are safe. Outside the fence, chaos waits. But fences require enemies. If a collapse is framed as divine punishment, then someone must have invited punishment. Moral causation seeks moral culprits. Outsiders, dissenters, impure groups, internal deviants. These categories become convenient because they can carry blame. The sacred does not need to prove guilt. It only needs to name it. Naming is enough to stabilize the story. From a distance, this can resemble conspiracy. Power uses religion to rewrite history, to consolidate control, to scapegoat opponents. And sometimes, historically, it has. But even when no single actor plans it, the pattern can still emerge systemically. Trauma produces a demand for certainty. Certainty produces tighter doctrine. Tighter doctrine produces suppression. Suppression produces a narrower archive. The narrower archive becomes the official past. The result is a kind of historical tunnel vision that can last longer than the empire that created it. This is where archaeology and institutional memory often collide. Material evidence can suggest complexity where texts suggest simplicity. A site can reveal multiple layers of practice where a later tradition claims there was always only one. A set of figurines, shrines, or iconographic motifs can hint at suppressed forms of devotion that never made it into the canonical story. Yet even archaeology is not immune to framing. Excavation is selective. Funding is political. Museums choose narratives. National identities prefer certain pasts over others. The modern world is also an institution, and it too can curate which origins feel acceptable. So the question grows uncomfortably contemporary. Is the story of religion's origin shaped more by what happened, or by what later systems needed people to believe happened? If religion began as a response to loss and uncertainty, then institutions may later have learned to manufacture a controlled version of loss and uncertainty to keep religion necessary. Fear of chaos can be cultivated. Stories of decline can be repeated. Prophecies of doom can be emphasized. The community remains dependent on the sacred order, because the sacred order is presented as the only barrier against collapse. This is not an accusation against one tradition. It is an observation about how human systems preserve themselves. In the next layer of fog, attention will turn toward modernity's strange relationship with religion, the era of science, secular states, and mass information. If humans began creating religion to cope with uncertainty, why does religion persist even when uncertainty can be explained in natural terms? Or is natural explanation simply another sacred narrative, another way to claim control over the unseen? Modernity likes to tell a clean story about itself. It imagines a slow awakening, superstition giving way to reason, myth dissolving into science, the sacred shrinking as the light expands. But when one looks closely, the sacred does not disappear, it changes masks. It moves into new institutions, new languages, new rituals. The human need that once built temples can also build ideologies. The human longing that once sought cosmic justice can also seek historical justice. The human desire for meaning does not evaporate when old gods are questioned. It migrates. And that migration complicates the original question. If religion began because humans needed it, what does it mean that humans still need something like it? The scientific revolution and the rise of secular governance did not abolish uncertainty. They reorganized it. The cosmos became describable in equations, but not necessarily comforting. The Earth became older than any traditional chronology. Humans became animals among animals, shaped by evolution, vulnerable to extinction. Natural laws replaced divine whims, yet natural laws can feel colder than any deity. A storm caused by atmospheric physics is not less destructive than a storm caused by an angry god. It is simply indifferent. Indifference is difficult for the human mind to inhabit. Religion has often offered a universe that cares. Even when it punishes with intention. Even when it is silent, the silence can be interpreted as meaningful. A secular universe, by contrast, can appear mute. For many people, that muteness is not liberation but loneliness. So modernity produces a countercurrent. As institutions grow more bureaucratic and life becomes more abstract, some individuals return to religion for intimacy, ritual as embodied certainty, prayer as conversation, community as refuge. Others do not return to religion as it was, but seek spiritual experience in new forms, meditation movements, occult revivals, new religious movements, or personalized blends of tradition and self-help. The sacred persists because the nervous system still responds to awe, to rhythm, to shared emotion, to the comfort of being watched by something benevolent. Yet there is another reason religion persists in modernity: complexity. As societies become larger and more specialized, most people cannot verify the systems they depend on. The supply chain, the financial system, the medical system, the state itself, these are invisible architectures that require trust. A modern citizen, like an ancient worshipper, often relies on intermediaries. One cannot personally examine every piece of evidence behind a vaccine, a climate model, or an economic policy. Expertise becomes priestly in function, even if its methods are different. This is not a claim that science is religion. It is an observation that human dependence on authority does not vanish. It relocates. And where authority relocates, myth-like narratives can form. Political ideologies can become sacred frameworks. They offer origin stories, heroes, martyrs, and promised futures. They define purity and contamination. They provide rituals, marches, pledges, public denunciations. They produce heresies and excommunications. Even when they reject the supernatural, they can adopt the emotional structure of religion, a moral universe, a battle between good and evil, a demand for total commitment. This suggests a deeper interpretation of religion's origin. Perhaps humans did not suddenly create religion. Perhaps humans always created sacred frameworks, and what changed over time was merely the form those frameworks took. If that is true, then the prehistoric emergence of religion might be seen as the moment when sacred framing became visible in durable patterns, burials, monuments, repeated rites. But the underlying impulse may have existed earlier as a quieter mental habit, a way to treat uncertainty as meaningful. Modernity intensifies uncertainty in a new way: information overload. In the ancient world, rumours travelled at the speed of footsteps. In the modern world, narratives travel instantly, competing for attention. Conspiracy theories flourish in such environments not because people are foolish, but because conspiracy is one of the oldest narrative structures humans possess. It converts chaos into intention. It makes suffering interpretable. It offers villains secret knowledge and a sense of being awake while others sleep. In its emotional architecture, conspiracy often resembles a religious experience: revelation, initiation, community, moral certainty. And because modern institutions are complex and sometimes opaque, conspiracy can feel plausible. When people cannot see how decisions are made, they imagine hidden rooms. When they feel powerless, they imagine puppet masters. The unseen becomes populated again, not by spirits of rivers, but by secret committees, shadow governments, invisible networks. So the original topic, why humans began creating religion, finds its echo in the present. Humans still create invisible agents when the world feels unmanageable. The agents have changed names, but the function remains: explanation, control, belonging. Yet modernity also offers something religion rarely offered in the same way: evidence that can revise itself. Science, at its best, institutionalizes doubt. It treats certainty as provisional. This is psychologically uncomfortable. Most humans prefer closure. Religion often provides closure, so modernity's demand for uncertainty can provoke backlash, a hunger to return to absolute narratives, whether religious or ideological. In that backlash, institutions can again learn to use sacred framing. Nationalism can sacralize land. Corporations can sacralize consumption. Influencers can sacralize identity. The sacred is not only in churches, it is wherever humans treat something as ultimate and unquestionable. This does not dissolve religion into mere social function. It suggests something more unsettling and more tender. The sacred might be a human perception of ultimacy, a way the mind marks what it cannot afford to lose. And that returns the story to loss, the oldest engine in this journey. Perhaps humans created religion because they sensed, even early on, that everything beloved is fragile. Children, partners, seasons, prey, harvest, the body itself. Religion may have been the mind's attempt to speak to fragility as if fragility could answer. In the next layer of fog, the focus will turn toward the last stubborn question. If religion is a response to absence and fragility, what happens when absence is manipulated? When authorities, ancient or modern, cultivate fear, silence alternatives, and manufacture dependence on a single sacred narrative? How can anyone tell the difference between genuine mystery and curated mystery? There is a particular kind of power that does not need chains. It does not even need constant threats. It only needs to convince people that without it, reality will unravel. This is the power of curated absence, the shaping of what people are allowed to know, the narrowing of what questions are safe to ask, the slow training of a community to fear its own curiosity. If religion began as a response to mystery, curated absence turns mystery into a resource. The oldest communities likely lived with uncertainty as a daily companion. They did not know why drought struck, why disease arrived, why one child lived and another did not. The mind reached for meaning, and meaning took the form of spirits, ancestors, gods. This impulse did not require manipulation. It was natural. But once humans discovered that meaning can regulate behavior, once they discovered that people obey more readily when obedience feels cosmic, then uncertainty itself could be shaped. Not always consciously, not always as a plot, often as instinct. Institutions, religious or secular, tend to preserve themselves. They do so by controlling narratives about legitimacy, why they exist, why they must continue, why alternatives are dangerous. In a sacred framework, this control often centers on one claim, that the institution mediates between ordinary life and ultimate reality. If ultimate reality is inaccessible without mediation, then mediation becomes indispensable. Indispensability is the heart of authority. This is why religious systems have so often developed barriers around knowledge. Restricted texts, restricted rites, sacred languages not spoken by ordinary people, training regimes that create a class of interpreters. Such barriers can protect the integrity of tradition. They can also protect the power of tradition's guardians. The effect is the same for the believer: dependence. And dependence can be intensified by fear. The fear is not always of physical punishment. It is often fear of metaphysical exile, damnation, impurity, cosmic disorder, the loss of meaning itself. A person may endure suffering to avoid losing the story that makes suffering bearable. In that sense, curated absence is not only censorship, it is emotional engineering. One can see echoes of this in many historical episodes: heresy trials, book burnings, iconoclasm, forced conversions. These are the dramatic forms. But there are quieter forms, discouraging certain questions, framing doubt as moral failure, equating loyalty to the community with loyalty to the deity. Over time, these quieter forms can be more effective than violence because they create self-policing minds. The believer becomes the guard. Yet curated absence is not limited to religious institutions. Modern systems do it too. Information can be overwhelmed rather than suppressed. Attention can be redirected rather than forbidden. Complexity can be used as a shield. When people feel they cannot understand the forces governing them, they are more likely to accept simplified narratives from anyone who sounds certain, whether that certainty is sacred or secular. So the question becomes personal as well as historical. How does anyone tell the difference between genuine mystery and engineered mystery? One answer lies in the nature of doubt. In many religious traditions, doubt is treated as a temptation, a weakness, or a threat. In many scientific traditions, doubt is treated as a tool. The difference is not always clean. Scientific institutions can also become dogmatic, and religious communities can also value inquiry. But the principle matters. Systems that survive on curated absence often fear questions that would reduce dependence. They prefer questions with approved answers. The earliest religious impulses, by contrast, may have been more exploratory. They may have been attempts to negotiate with the unknown rather than to close it. A local spirit can be bargained with, misinterpreted, even offended, and the community can adapt. A centralized, moralized deity tied to an institution is less negotiable, because negotiation weakens the institution's monopoly. This is why the transition from plural sacred worlds to singular sacred order is so consequential. Pluralism is messy, but it is resilient. If one shrine fails, another remains. If one story no longer fits, another can be told. Singular order is cleaner, but it is brittle. It must defend itself by defending its borders. Those borders are often defended by controlling history. When a religion claims that its origin is pure and singular, it must manage evidence of diversity. It must reinterpret earlier practices as errors, as shadows, as incomplete revelations. It must turn complexity into a linear pilgrimage toward its own authority. This is not always malicious. It is often how identities maintain coherence. But coherence can come at the cost of truth. And truth, in the archaeological sense, is already fragile. Material evidence is partial. Textual evidence is curated. Oral evidence is dismissed or romanticized. The past is a contested field, and religion is one of the strongest magnets pulling interpretation toward meaning rather than uncertainty. The magnet is not always wrong. Sometimes meaning is the best possible explanation for why humans acted as they did, but meaning is also the easiest explanation to exploit. So the conspiracy dimension of this topic does not require a single secret cabal rewriting history. It requires only a repeating human pattern, the tendency of powerful institutions to preserve narratives that sustain their power. That pattern can operate across centuries through normal decisions, which texts to copy, which rituals to teach, which stories to celebrate, which doubts to punish, which memories to honour, which to bury. And buried memories do not always stay buried. They seep back through cracks, through archaeology, through rediscovered manuscripts, through comparative studies, through the stubborn recurrence of outlawed practices in folk culture. Each rediscovery threatens the illusion of singular origin, and each threat provokes new strategies of interpretation, dismissal, absorption, reframing. Absorption is often the most effective. An institution can take an inconvenient discovery and declare it part of the plan, part of the prophecy, part of a larger truth that only the institution can interpret. The mystery remains, but it is now owned. Owned mystery is the most profitable kind. This brings the journey to a narrow edge. If humans created religion to cope with fragility, and institutions learned to curate fragility to remain necessary, then religion is both an answer and a perpetuation of the question. It heals, and it maintains the wound. In the next movement, the story will begin to drift toward resolution without closure, toward the recognition that religion's origin may be less a historical moment than a recurring human behaviour. And yet one final layer remains, the intimate layer, the one that cannot be archived or governed fully, the private experience of awe, grief and presence that still visits individuals in the night. If that private experience is the true root, can any institution ever truly own it? Even after temples rise and fall, even after texts are canonized and censored, even after empires claim divine mandate and then collapse into dust, something remains stubbornly small and personal, a human being alone with a feeling that the world is more than it appears. It may come in grief, when a name is spoken into an empty room and the air feels briefly occupied. It may come in awe, when a night sky seems too vast to be merely mechanical. It may come in terror, when coincidence feels like pursuit. It may come in tenderness, when gratitude rises without an object, like a prayer searching for a listener. If religion began anywhere, perhaps it began here, inside private experience, long before it became public structure. This possibility does not deny the social functions of religion, it deepens them. A society can use religion to coordinate strangers, but the reason religion persuades strangers is that it speaks to something already intimate in each person. The desire to be seen, the desire for the universe to be intelligible, the refusal to accept that love ends without leaving an imprint. Prehistoric evidence can never fully capture this interior life. The record gives only shadows, burials, art, monuments, repeated patterns. But those shadows point toward minds capable of symbolic depth. A body placed carefully suggests mourning. A painted animal deep in a cave suggests reverence or obsession, or both. A stone circle suggests coordination around something that cannot be eaten or worn. These are not proofs of doctrine, they are fingerprints of meaning-making. And meaning-making is not an invention of one era. It is a recurring human activity. This is why the word "suddenly" in the original title can feel misleading. Humans did not suddenly become religious as if a switch flipped. The more likely story is slower and stranger. Human cognition developed capacities, language, theory of mind, pattern detection that made invisible agents plausible. Human societies expanded in ways that made shared moral narratives useful. Human environments shifted in ways that made catastrophe and uncertainty frequent companions. Over time, these pressures braided together until religion became visible as tradition and institution. But the root impulse, treating uncertainty as conversation, may have been present as soon as humans could imagine a mind other than their own. This is also why religion is so adaptable. It can shrink into a household and expand into an empire. It can soften into personal spirituality and harden into law. It can ride along trade routes and survive in exile. It can merge, split, reform, and resurrect. The sacred is not a single object, it is a way of arranging experience. And because it is a way of arranging experience, it can never be fully eliminated. Even aggressively secular societies generate their own sacreds, ideals that cannot be questioned, histories that must be honoured, moral categories treated as absolute. Humans seem unable to live without some form of ultimacy, something treated as higher than ordinary preference. That ultimacy can be beautiful. It can also be dangerous. The danger appears when ultimacy becomes monopolized. When a single institution claims total authority over meaning, it can weaponize fragility. It can cultivate guilt as obedience. It can declare doubt as infection. It can edit history into a narrow corridor and call that corridor salvation. But the beauty appears when ultimacy becomes humility. When the sacred is treated not as a weapon, but as a reminder that humans do not control everything. When ritual becomes not coercion, but care. When myth becomes not propaganda, but a container for grief and wonder. So the question becomes less about the existence of religion, and more about the style of religion a society chooses to inhabit. Yet even this choice is complicated. People rarely choose their sacred frameworks in a vacuum. They inherit them, they absorb them as children, they feel them in family rhythms, in language, in the emotional climate of home. A person can reject doctrine and still feel the shape of it in their reflexes: shame, awe, longing, fear. Religion leaves traces in the nervous system as much as in books. This is why the origin question remains haunting. It is not only about prehistory, it is about the present listener, in a quiet room, feeling the pull of a story older than memory. If humans began creating religion to cope with absence, then every moment of absence can reactivate the impulse. Every death, every collapse, every inexplicable loss, every coincidence that feels too perfect to be random. The sacred returns because the mind returns to it, again and again, as if the mind is designed to search for a witness. And perhaps this is the final twist. The witness humans seek may not always be external. It may be internal, conscience, memory, the part of the self that watches the self. Religion can externalize the witness into gods and ancestors, then internalize it back into moral feeling. The forms change, but the watching remains. The question that remains then is not whether religion began once, but whether it ever truly begins at all, or whether it is an emergent property of being a creature who knows it will die, and still chooses to love. In the last movement of this journey, The story will not close the mystery. It will narrow it to one final open edge. If religion is born from the need to be seen, what happens in a world where being seen is constant, where surveillance is technological, where attention is monetized, where identity becomes performance? Does the ancient hunger for an invisible witness fade? Or does it become more desperate because the visible world is too loud to feel meaningful? A world that sees everything should, in theory, make gods unnecessary. Cameras watch streets, algorithms watch habits, devices watch sleep and heart rate. Even silence has become measurable, and yet the ancient hunger does not dissolve. It only changes flavour. The modern witness is constant, but it is not comforting. It records without understanding. It observes without mercy. It knows patterns, but it does not know meaning. In such a world, religion does not vanish. It competes with technology, with ideology, with entertainment, with conspiratorial revelation, with a frantic attempt to turn life into a story that feels coherent. The prehistoric mind looked into storms and saw intention. The modern mind looks into systems and sees intention. When a credit score changes, when a feed shifts, when a job disappears, people rarely feel they are encountering pure randomness. They feel handled, they feel sorted, they feel judged by unseen criteria. The old sensation of invisible agency returns wearing a new mask. It is not difficult to see why conspiracy narratives flourish here. They offer what religion has often offered: a hidden order behind events, a moral explanation for suffering, and the comfort of belonging to an awakened minority. Where traditional religion may say, "the gods see," conspiracy says, "they see." The pronoun changes, but the structure stays. Chaos becomes intention, fear becomes story, story becomes community, and when community is fragile, any story that binds becomes valuable. This is the quiet loop closing back on the origin question. Humans may have begun creating religion not because they were ignorant, but because they were sensitive to patterns, to loss, to the tension between what can be known and what must be endured. Modernity has not eliminated that tension, it has multiplied it. Knowledge is abundant, but meaning is scarce. Information is endless, but wisdom is not guaranteed. The more data a person receives, the more they may hunger for a single narrative that makes it feel like something. This hunger can produce beauty. It can also produce vulnerability. In the ancient world, sacred institutions could curate absence by restricting texts, shaping rituals, controlling interpretation. In the modern world, absence can be curated by overload. When everything is available, nothing feels graspable. In that fog, the mind again seeks interpreters, people who speak with certainty, people who promise the real story. They may be priests, pundits, influencers, or self-appointed prophets. The role persists because the need persists. So the deepest question becomes less historical and more existential. Is religion a chapter in human development, or is it a permanent feature of human consciousness? If it is permanent, then every era will generate its own religions, even if it rejects that word. The sacred may appear as national destiny. It may appear as economic salvation. It may appear as the promise of technological transcendence, immortality through medicine, resurrection through data, paradise through progress. These modern sacreds often carry the same emotional ingredients: hope, dread, moral urgency, and the promise that suffering is not meaningless. But just as ancient religion could become a tool of control, modern sacred narratives can also become tools of control. The methods change, the mechanics remain. People are told what to fear. They are told whom to blame. They are told which questions are permitted. They are told that the world will collapse unless obedience is maintained. And yet, beneath all of these public architectures, there remains the private experience that cannot be fully governed. The moment a person feels awe without needing an explanation. The moment grief becomes love rather than despair. the moment the night sky makes the ego quiet. These experiences are not proof of doctrine, they are proof of a particular kind of mind, one that searches for a witness because it cannot bear the idea that everything precious disappears without echo. This is why the origin of religion refuses to be pinned to one cause. It is not only cognition, not only social coordination, not only catastrophe, not only power. It is the intersection of all of them, braided through time. Humans likely began creating religion because the world was too vast and too indifferent to live inside without adding a layer of meaning. But once that layer exists, it becomes a habitat, and habitats attract architects. Institutions shape it, empires exploit it, reformers refine it, dissidents fracture it, and every time it fractures, the shards become seeds for new sacred forms. So the final image is not of an invention, but of a recurring act. A human being stands at the edge of the unknown and speaks. Sometimes the voice names an ancestor, sometimes it names a god, sometimes it names a theory, a nation, a movement, a hidden enemy. The naming is the same gesture, an attempt to make the unseen answerable, and perhaps this is the most unsettling possibility of all. If religion began as the mind's refusal to accept blank space, then the true mystery is not why humans created religion, but why humans so rarely tolerate silence. What would it mean to sit with the universe as it is, beautiful, terrifying, and possibly indifferent, without forcing it to become a moral narrative? Yet even that question may be too sharp for the night. The night does not demand conclusions, it only asks for honesty, and for gentleness toward the human need to make meaning. So the story ends as it began, in a room where the past cannot be fully recovered. The earliest prayers, if they existed, have evaporated. The first rituals, if they happened, have become dust. Only the pattern remains. Whenever humans face absence, they build a bridge made of symbols, and they walk it as if someone is waiting on the other side. But if no one is waiting, if the other side is only echo, does that make the bridge less real? Or does it reveal that the bridge was always meant to lead back into the human heart, where the unseen has lived all along?